You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, now we're going to discuss 1963 March on Washington. Now, for people of color, nothing could stop them from fulfilling their historic destiny. And during the 1960s, working people joined and led civil rights protests, anti-war demonstrations, feminist projects, gay and lesbian initiatives, and militant movements to empower people of color and poor people across the board. And as we understand, more than 20 years after canceling his 1941 March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph led a new March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms on August 28, 1963. It was endorsed by every major civil rights organization and the AFL-CIO's industrial department, which was sponsored by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Union of A. Philip Randolph, the United Auto Workers, and the Negro American Council. And this march turned out some 250,000 people, including many thousands of union members. And Martin Luther King Jr. is going to rise to national prominence as a result of this particular March on Washington. So let's go to film clip 3 and let's appreciate the time and the era.
John Kennedy didn't think the civil rights struggle was his most pressing problem. His greatest worry was communism, the Soviet Union, and the possibility of nuclear war.
The real problem is the Soviet desire to expand their power and influence. If Mr. Khrushchev would concern himself with the real interests of the people of the Soviet Union, that they have a higher standard of living, to protect his own security, there's no real reason why the United States and the Soviet Union, separated by so many thousands of miles of land and water, both rich countries, both with very energetic people, should not be able to live in peace. So the combination of these two systems in conflict around the world in a nuclear age is what makes the 60s so dangerous.
It was just a little while ago I glued my ears to the radio. The announcer was saying we better beware, a crisis was hanging way up in the air. Crawling on the ground, swimming in the sea, dead for me. Well, I didn't know if I was for or against it. He was yelling and screaming a mile a minute. Well, he said, here comes the president, but first this word from Pepsodent. Have whiter teeth, have cleaner breath when you're facing nuclear death. And then President John began to speak, and I knew right away he wouldn't be weak. Well, he said he'd seen some missile bases and terrible smiles on Cuban faces, close pictures, carrying land reform too far, giving land to the USSR. Well, he said we mustn't be afraid, we're setting up a little blockade. Put our ships along the Cuban shores, and if the Russian bear yells and roars, we'll let him have it.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest America has ever come to atomic destruction, shook up many Americans, especially young Americans, just as they had been shaken by the violent reaction to civil rights protesters.
We thought, why do we have to be afraid of dying? Are we really going to die? Is there really going to be a nuclear war? And why do we have to think about this? This is too big for us. I remember the absolutely stunned hush. I remember the sense of wanting to stay indoors, of being actually afraid to walk outside, not because something was going to fall from the sky at this particular moment, but because the sense of crisis was so intense and our unpreparedness for it, and our sense of being afflicted with it was so intense that you did not want to walk alone out under that sky.
And television was bringing home other distressing realities.
I think we in the Midwest had been sheltered from what was happening in the South, what was happening in the black community in the South. And when television came on the horizon, we weren't sheltered anymore. And we saw what human beings were doing to each other. And it was really very shocking. very hurtful.
We were brought up very idealistic. I was taught that there were things that were right and wrong and that America stood for certain things. And I got to a certain age and I looked around and I said, except it's not true. That there, you know, and my first instinct was, well, this is clearly, you know, something's fallen through the cracks here and we just have to point it out and say, you know, there are these people who are hungry or people who can't vote or people getting beaten up. And, you know, if we just make people aware of that, that it'll get solved right away. And, of course, it didn't get solved right away. And, therefore, we began to challenge more and more the lies. And I really think that that's the basis of my anger and outrage in the 60s, was that I had been lied to about what America was all about. I liked what I had been told America was about, and I was simply trying to make the reality conform with the promise. And the more it became difficult to make the reality to conform to the promise, the angrier I got, and my friends got.
Thoroughly alarmed by the violent white reaction to the protesters, President Kennedy had to act. He sent a civil rights bill to Congress that, if passed, would outlaw discrimination in restaurants, hotels, swimming pools, and other public places. Every major civil rights organization, plus union and student groups from all over the country, banded together to stage a massive demonstration in Washington in support of the bill. They hoped an impressive and peaceful rally would force Congress to pass it. Hundreds of thousands of people responded to the call. What took place that day was one of the most memorable events of the 60s and a high point in the civil rights struggle.
I couldn't believe that that many people were there. I just assumed I would walk right up front and just sit there and listen.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
And boy, when he stopped, it's sort of like history stopped for a moment and looked down and said, hey, watch what's going to happen now. And you knew you were on a roll when you left Washington that day. You knew something had happened. We brought an army down here, and America was going to have to change. God damn it, America was going to have to change, and you knew it. And unlike all the other bull crap that I had participated in my life, where you could sit up endlessly as we did in college and do your sophomore-ish philosophy, and then you get out of the dorm at 6:30 in the morning and nothing changed. When you came home from Washington, it started to change.
America was heading into unknown territory in which a way of life was changing and 100-year-old social customs were breaking up. The country badly needed a captain it could follow. And for most Americans in late 1963, especially young Americans, that man was John Kennedy. His words had stirred a generation and motivated many to action. Maybe he'd been slow to fully support civil rights, but now he seemed ready to push ahead. Then, suddenly...
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun, and no one guessed that a man so blessed would perish by sudden shout, and heaven held its breath, and the dreams of a multitude of men went with him to his death. The heart of the world weighs heavy with the helplessness of tears for a man shot down in the Texas sun in the summer of his years.
Okay, now let's deal with what is known as the War on Poverty. In the 1964 congressional elections, the voters gave Lyndon Johnson the most liberal Congress in American history. And this best explains why Lyndon Johnson was able to enact a sweeping program of reform legislation in 1965 and 1966. Quantifiable evidence indicates that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 caused a dramatic increase in the proportion of Southern African Americans who were registered to vote. The Immigration Act of 1965 ended racially based immigration quotas. And many of the laws that were part of Johnson's war on poverty primarily focused on improving opportunities for the nation's poor. The Medicare program enacted in 1965 provided insurance against medical and hospital bills for the elderly. The war on poverty directly attacked the housing, health, and nutritional problems of the poor. And as a result of the war on poverty, the number of elderly Americans living in poverty declined dramatically. However, the war on poverty did not give sufficient attention to poverty in female-headed households. But the civil rights movement impacted the Johnson administration so much so that by 1964, the president will sign the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination by race, color, sex, religion, or national origin in voter registration, employment, public education, and public accommodations. In August 1965, the Voting Rights Act barred states from using literacy tests and other devices to disenfranchise people of color, and it empowered federal officials to register voters that were turned away by local authorities. And as I shared with you, the most important was Johnson's war on poverty. The Office of Economic Opportunity administered programs assisting poor people. The Job Corps provided training and employment to youth from poor communities. Community action programs funded social services provided by local civil rights projects. Adult literacy program and the Head Start program for preschoolers became very popular. Congress passed the Medicare and Medicaid Act in 1965. Medicare subsidized health insurance for the elderly. Medicaid paid medical expenses for poor households. So we're going to go back to the documentary Making Sense of the 60s, and we're going to appreciate how the war in Vietnam is going to undermine Johnson's war on poverty. So let's go to film clip number 4 and appreciate the war on poverty.
In 1964, America...
Okay, now let's deal with movements for change, Black Power. Despite all of the positive changes coming from Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, nothing could stop white supremacist terrorism and their influence on conservative America. And despite these obstacles, movements for change continued and became more militant. Blacks, Chicanos, and American Indians rebelled throughout the country and demanded an end to prejudice, discrimination, segregation, or, as was known in South Africa, apartheid. The rise of the Third World, especially the creation of new African nations and the revolution springing up in Latin America, lent credence to the new militancy. Issues of social control were demonstrated by the threat of violence and the use of violence. Blacks, Chicanos, Native people challenged past practices of economic marginalization, political disfranchisement, and social discrimination, and educational deprivation. The 1964 race rebellion in Harlem was triggered by the shooting of a black teenager by a white police officer. The underlying reason for the Watts Rebellion of 1965 was that African Americans were frustrated and angry over their joblessness and lack of opportunity. The Kerner Report, issued in 1968 by the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, blamed the urban rebellions of the mid to late 60s on white racism within American society. After Malcolm X's assassination, Stokely Carmichael, in his 1966 call for Black Power, argued that to be truly free from white oppression, African Americans must elect black candidates, organize their own schools, and control their own institutions. And in response to the concept of Black Power, groups such as CORE, the Committee on Racial Equality, and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, began to purge whites from their membership rolls. So let's go back to a documentary making sense of the 60s, and let's appreciate the Black Power movement, the Black experience. Let's go to film clip 5.
The anti-war movement almost had a spiritual, religious quality to it, if you will.